The Callaway mansion stood like a fortress on the outskirts of Chicago. Towering iron gates guarded its pristine grounds, where not a single leaf dared to fall out of place. The structure itself was magnificent. Sleek glass panels, sharp modern edges, and a silent elegance that whispered of unimaginable wealth. But inside, it was cold. Not just from the chilled air circulating through its flawless interior, but from the absence of warmth, of life. Wyatt Callaway thrived in control. His mornings were precise. He rose at 5, exercised in his state-of-the-art home gym, and reviewed the stock market over black coffee, always taken without sugar. His staff knew better than to disrupt the rhythm of his day. The house was a machine, running smoothly, emotionlessly, just like its owner. Dressed in an immaculately tailored suit, Wyatt descended the grand staircase, his footsteps echoing against the marble floors. He barely glanced at the housekeeper gathering his untouched breakfast plate. He never ate more than a few bites. Efficiency was everything. "Sir, your schedule for today," his assistant, Neil, informed him, handing over a tablet. Wyatt skimmed through the meetings, the negotiations. Nothing unexpected. That was how he preferred it. He gave a curt nod, already shifting his mind to the first deal of the day. Then he saw her. She was standing near the kitchen entrance, adjusting the cuff of her uniform. Haven Ellis, his new housekeeper. Neil had mentioned hiring someone new, but Wyatt had barely paid attention. Now, as he took in the sight of her, tall, with steady brown eyes that held no trace of deference, he felt an unfamiliar irritation. Most employees avoided eye contact. This woman met his gaze head-on, her chin slightly lifted as if daring him to say something. "You're late," Wyatt stated, though he wasn't certain she actually was. "I was told to start at 7, Haven replied evenly, without flinching. Wyatt didn't like that. Most people fumbled in his presence, eager to please, terrified of making mistakes. This woman was different. "Do your job. Stay out of my way," he said dismissively, already turning. Haven didn't reply. She simply walked past him, efficiently clearing the table. It was as if his presence was of no consequence. For the first time in years, Wyatt felt something stir. An irritation, a curiosity. And he didn't like it. Wyatt is used to being in control, but something about Haven's defiant indifference unsettles him. The Callaway mansion was silent, as it always was. No laughter, no warmth, just a perfectly curated world of efficiency and control. Haven moved through it with purpose, but unlike the others who worked here, she didn't fade into the background. She wasn't one to disappear simply because that was what was expected. She quickly learned the rhythm of the house. Wyatt Callaway operated on routine, and everyone catered to it without question. But Haven wasn't like the others. She noticed the untouched plates of catered meals, the way he barely seemed to acknowledge his own home beyond his study and bedroom. So, instead of leaving the same bland meals for him, she cooked. Nothing extravagant, just real food, the kind that carried warmth. The first time he noticed, she was wiping down the counters as he walked in. He glanced at the plate, then at her. "I didn't ask for this." His voice was clipped, controlled. "I know," she replied simply, not bothering to turn around. His footsteps stopped behind her. The silence stretched. "You're wasting your time." She shrugged. "Maybe." The plate wasn't full when she collected it later. Haven went about her work the same way, ignoring the tension that had started to creep into the air whenever Wyatt was around. He was watching her now, though she never let on that she noticed. It wasn't interest, not exactly. More like irritation, as if he couldn't figure out why she wasn't bending to his unspoken rules. Late one evening, as she passed by his study, she answered a call in hushed tones. "No, Jonah, I can't come home yet," she whispered. "Just take your medicine, all right? I'll be there soon." A long pause. A softer voice now. "I know. I miss you too." Wyatt, hidden just beyond the doorway, had meant to leave his office for the night. Instead, he stood frozen, listening. Haven's voice carried something he hadn't heard before. Gentleness, worry, exhaustion. She had a life beyond this house, a weight she carried. For a reason he couldn't explain, that thought stayed with him. Haven's small apartment was nothing like the Callaway mansion. The The walls were thin, the furniture worn, and the space barely enough for 2 people. But it was home. It was warm, lived in, full of love in a way Wyatt Calloway's pristine estate could never be. She unlocked the door quietly, careful not to wake Jonah if he had managed to get some rest. The soft glow of a lamp in the living room told her otherwise. He was sitting on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, a half-empty glass of water on the table beside him. "You're supposed to be sleeping," she said, walking over to feel his forehead. Jonah gave her a tired smile. "I tried." The shadows under his eyes were deeper than the last time she saw him. The sickness was pulling at him, making him thinner, more fragile. Haven felt the familiar wave of helplessness settle in her chest, but she pushed it down. Jonah didn't need to see her worry. "You need to rest," she murmured, sitting beside him. "I will," he promised. "Tell me about the new job first. Is the boss as terrible as you thought?" Haven exhaled sharply. "Worse." That made him chuckle, though it quickly turned into a cough. Haven instinctively reached for his medicine, shaking out 2 pills into her palm. Jonah took them without complaint, but his eyes studied her carefully. "Is he like them?" he asked after a moment. Haven didn't have to ask what he meant. People like Wyatt Calloway, people who had power, who had money, who never stopped to think about the people their decisions ruined. She thought of the cold, meticulous way Wyatt ran his world, of his sharp stare whenever she defied expectations, of the untouched, catered meals replaced by something real. "He's exactly like them," she said. Jonah leaned his head against the couch, then quit. "I can't," she admitted. "It pays too well, and they needed every cent." Jonah didn't argue. He knew better than anyone what their reality was. His surgery wasn't a matter of if, it was a matter of when. And when had to come soon. Haven ran a hand through his hair, the way she used to when he was younger. He leaned into her touch, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself to forget about deadlines, hospital bills, and the ruthless man she worked for. But reality never stayed away for long. Wyatt Calloway wasn't used to distractions. His days were precise, structured, void of unnecessary emotion. Yet, over the past week, his focus had been slipping, because of her. Haven Ellis moved through his house like she belonged nowhere and everywhere at once. She didn't cower under his scrutiny, nor did she seek his approval. She simply existed, unapologetically, and that, more than anything, unsettled him. Tonight, as he stepped into the dimly lit kitchen for a late cup of coffee, he found her standing by the sink, rubbing her temples. A quiet sigh escaped her lips, one that carried more weight than she probably intended to show. She didn't hear him at first. He could have left, ignored the moment, let her remain a mystery. But something about the slump in her shoulders, so different from the defiance she usually carried, made him speak. "You look like hell." Haven startled, turning sharply. "Excuse me?" Wyatt leaned against the counter, studying her. There were dark circles under her eyes, her usual sharp gaze dulled by exhaustion. She was running on fumes. "You're overworked," he stated plainly. Her fingers curled slightly at her sides, but she kept her expression unreadable. "That's none of your concern." He should have let it go. But before he could stop himself, the words were already out. "I'll increase your pay." Haven's posture stiffened. "Or if you need," he hesitated before continuing, his voice measured. "If you're struggling, I can loan you." "Don't." The word came out sharp, cutting through the air. Wyatt raised a brow. "It's just money, Ellis." She exhaled, anger flickering beneath the exhaustion. "To you, maybe, but not to me. You think you can throw money at problems and make them go away?" His patience thinned. "It would make your life easier." Haven let out a short, humorless laugh. "I don't need your charity." She turned and walked past him, shoulders tense, jaw set. She wasn't just rejecting the money. She was rejecting him. Wyatt watched her go, irritation coiling inside him. Most people would have taken the offer without hesitation. But Haven Ellis wasn't like most people. Something about her reaction nagged at him. Later that night, as he sat in his office, the unsettled feeling remained. He opened his laptop, fingers hovering over the keyboard before typing her name into a search. He wasn't sure what he expected to find. But as the results loaded, something about the name Ellis sent a spark of recognition through him. The mansion was silent, save for the occasional hum of the central heating and the rhythmic ticking of the clock in the hallway. Wyatt had spent the last few hours in his office, staring at his screen, but his focus had drifted. The search results on Haven Ellis had revealed fragments of a story he didn't fully understand yet, pieces of a past that felt uncomfortably close to something familiar. Stepping into the dimly lit kitchen for another coffee, he paused. Haven was there, asleep. She sat at the small table, her head resting on her folded arms, her breathing slow and steady. A faint crease lined her forehead, even in sleep, as if she were still carrying the weight of a long day. Her uniform was slightly wrinkled, and her exhaustion was evident in the way her body had simply given in. Wyatt wasn't sure why he lingered. He had seen countless people overwork themselves before. Executives who pushed too hard, employees who never stopped chasing. He had never given it a second thought. But this was different. His gaze drifted to the barely touched dinner beside her. Homemade, not catered. She had probably cooked after finishing an entire day's work. He didn't wake her. Instead, without fully understanding why, he shrugged off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders. It was instinctive, quick, like brushing away a stray thought. Yet, when he straightened, he felt strangely unsettled. Haven shifted slightly at the warmth, but didn't wake. For a long moment, Wyatt just stood there, watching her. The quiet room, the softness of the moment, it was foreign to him. He had spent years keeping people at a distance. Yet here he was, standing in his own kitchen, covering a woman he barely knew with his own jacket. It meant nothing. And yet, as he walked away, he couldn't quite convince himself of that. Haven woke to the faint scent of something familiar. Her brows furrowed as she sat up, rubbing her eyes. The kitchen was still empty, untouched, the house still cloaked in its usual silence. But then she noticed it. The jacket draped over her shoulders. His jacket. Her breath caught for a moment as she ran her fingers over the expensive fabric. The realization sent an unexpected warmth through her, not from the jacket itself, but from the fact that someone had put it there. Wyatt Calloway didn't seem like the type to care. And yet, somehow he had. Wyatt sat in his office, his fingers drumming against the polished surface of his desk. The screen before him glowed with search results, financial records, and old news articles. Every piece led to the same conclusion. Haven Ellis was not just another employee. Her father, Simon Ellis, had once been a respected financial officer at Calloway Enterprises. The scandal that followed, embezzlement, dismissal, disgrace, had ruined his reputation and left his family in financial ruin. But as Wyatt sifted through the details, the inconsistencies became glaring. Simon Ellis had never truly been investigated. The accusations had been enough to erase him, and someone within the company had ensured he took the fall. Wyatt clenched his jaw. Someone in his company had orchestrated this. And now, years later, his daughter worked under his roof, unknowingly tied to the very empire that had destroyed her family. The weight of the revelation settled uncomfortably in his chest. Should he tell her? She already looked at him with defiance. If she knew the truth, knew that his company had played a role in her father's downfall, she would never forgive him. He exhaled, pinching the bridge of his nose. He wasn't responsible for the past. He had been young, too buried in expanding his empire to question every decision his board had made. But none of that would matter to Haven. The truth would shatter everything. A quiet creak of the office door pulled him from his thoughts. His gaze snapped toward the entrance, where Haven stood, her posture tense. "I was cleaning," she said, though her voice held an edge. She never spoke without confidence. This time, there was hesitation. Wyatt followed her line of sight. His desk, the files, the name Ellis printed across a yellow document. His pulse slowed, then quickened. Haven stepped closer, her expression guarded. "Why do you have files on my father?" Wyatt's throat tightened. She hadn't seen enough. Not yet, but she had seen enough to ask questions. A silence stretched between them, heavy with something neither of them had been prepared for. Wyatt had built his life around control, but in that moment, he realized he was dangerously close to losing it. Haven's fingers tightened around the worn edges of the document, her eyes scanning the page as if it might rearrange itself into something less damning. But the name was clear: Simon Ellis, her father. She lifted her gaze to Wyatt, her expression a mixture of disbelief and fury. "Explain this." Wyatt's posture remained composed, but she saw it. The slight tightening of his jaw, the way his fingers curled against the desk. He wasn't indifferent. He was calculating. "I don't owe you an explanation," he said finally, voice even. Haven let out a sharp laugh, but there was no humor in it. "You don't owe me an explanation?" Her grip on the file tightened. "I found my father's name on your desk, in your house, and you don't think I deserve to know why?" Wyatt exhaled, his expression unreadable. "I know who your father was." The words were a slap, but Haven forced herself to stand taller. "Was?" Wyatt hesitated. "I did some research," she scoffed. "Research? Like I'm some kind of case study?" "Haven, don't." Her voice was sharp, cutting through the tension. "How long have you known?" A pause. "Too long." Her stomach twisted. "Since before you hired me?" "No," his answer came quickly, but that only fueled her anger. "But you knew," she accused. "And you let me work here. Let me think this was just a job. That you were just—" She exhaled shakily, trying to steady herself. "You knew." Wyatt's gaze darkened. "I didn't have anything to do with what happened to him." Haven barked out another humorless laugh. "Oh, so that's supposed to make it better?" His voice remained controlled. "Yes." Her chest ached, but she refused to let the emotion rise. "You expect me to believe that? That this whole thing is just some coincidence?" Wyatt's expression flickered, just for a second, with something she couldn't quite name. Guilt? Frustration? Regret? "I didn't know about your father when I hired you," he said carefully. "I didn't know what happened to him." Haven wanted to believe him. She hated that she wanted to. But trust wasn't something she could afford. Not when it came to men like him. "I'm done," she said, her voice tight. Wyatt's expression barely changed. "You're overreacting." Her temper snapped. "My father's life was ruined by your company, and you think I'm overreacting?" A beat of silence. Wyatt didn't apologize. He didn't try to explain himself further. He just watched her, like he was trying to understand why this mattered so much to her when it was just another file on his desk. Haven forced herself to breathe, to stay in control. "I quit." She slammed the document onto the desk and turned toward the door. Wyatt didn't stop her. She wished he had. The Calloway mansion felt different, quieter. Wyatt had never cared for the silence before. It was expected, controlled, but now it felt wrong. Haven was gone. He hadn't tried to stop her. He could have. He could have said something, anything, but he had let her walk out that door, let her leave with anger simmering in her eyes. And now she was all he could think about. Sitting at his desk, he stared at the file she had thrown down. Simon Ellis, a name he had never paid attention to before. But now, as he read through every page, every financial record tied to the case, something wasn't right. The numbers didn't add up. The transactions weren't conclusive. Simon Ellis had been accused of embezzlement, but where was the proof? Wyatt clicked through archived reports on his laptop, frustration tightening in his chest. Why had he never questioned this before? And then, he saw it. A signature, bold, deliberate, on one of the reports that had condemned Simon Ellis. Derek Caldwell. Wyatt leaned back in his chair, his pulse steady but sharp. Caldwell had been a problem before. A rival. A man who thrived on deception and hidden agendas. If there was a scandal in the past, Caldwell was always somewhere near it. Wyatt's phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. He glanced at the screen. Unknown number. He answered, already expecting trouble. "You really should stop digging, Calloway." Wyatt stilled. Caldwell. There was an amused edge to his voice, casual but laced with warning. Wyatt's grip on the phone tightened. "Funny, I don't remember asking for your opinion. You're looking into things that don't concern you." "You mean things that concern you?" A pause. A low chuckle. "I'm giving you a chance to walk away from this," Caldwell continued. "You start pulling at threads, and your empire might just unravel. Be smart, Calloway. Let it go." Wyatt's jaw clenched. He didn't take well to threats. I don't take orders, Caldwell sighed. Then I guess we're going to have a problem. The line went dead. Wyatt lowered the phone, exhaling slowly. So this wasn't just about the past. It was about power, about control. And Caldwell had just made a mistake. He had given Wyatt a reason to fight. Without hesitation, Wyatt picked up his phone again and dialed. I need a private investigator, he said. Someone discreet. If Caldwell thought threats would keep him silent, he had grossly underestimated him. Haven sat beside Jonah's bed, gripping his frail hand as the rhythmic beeping of the hospital monitor filled the room. His face was paler than it had been the day before, his breaths coming slower, more labored. Hey, he murmured, his lips cracking into the smallest smile. You look worse than me. She let out a quiet laugh, though it was brittle. Not possible, but it was. She hadn't slept in days, and her body was running on nothing but worry and exhaustion. The surgery was no longer an option. It was a necessity, and she didn't have the money. A knock at the door made her tense. Her friend Lena, a nurse who had helped Jonah before, stepped inside. Haven, she said gently, the hospital won't wait much longer. You need to decide. I don't have a decision to make, she whispered. I just don't have the money. Lena hesitated. There's one person who does. Haven already knew who she meant, and she hated that her mind had gone there, too. She swallowed against the bitterness. Wyatt Calloway was the last person she wanted to see, but Jonah needed her to put her pride aside. Wyatt wasn't expecting her. When he opened his office door and found Haven standing there, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her face carefully blank, something in him shifted. She looked different. Not in control, not guarded, just tired. For the first time since she'd left, he didn't have a sharp remark ready. What do you want? His voice was calm, but not cold. Haven hesitated, hating the words before they even left her lips. I need your help. The silence stretched. Wyatt studied her carefully, and she hated how much she felt exposed under that gaze. Then, without hesitation, he said, Whatever it is, it's yours. She flinched. You don't even know what I'm asking. I don't care. That was what broke her. She had been prepared for conditions, for some cold, calculated response. But not this. Not the quiet sincerity. Still, she couldn't let herself trust it. I'll pay you back, she said quickly. He shook his head. No, you won't. I'm not taking charity, Calloway. He sighed, stepping closer. It's not charity. Her breath hitched at the sudden proximity. She wanted to push him away, wanted to keep her walls high, but for the first time, she saw something in him that didn't feel like power. It felt like something real, and that terrified her more than anything. The waiting room was cold, too bright, and smelled of antiseptic. Haven sat in one of the stiff chairs, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. The doctors had taken Jonah into surgery over an hour ago. Every second that passed felt like an eternity. She had done everything she could, fought, sacrificed, swallowed her pride. And yet, all she could do now was wait. A cup of coffee appeared in front of her. She didn't have to look up to know who held it. I don't want coffee, she murmured. Wyatt didn't move. You haven't eaten all day. She huffed a quiet breath, still refusing to look at him. How would you know? I pay attention. That made her flinch, because it felt true. He sat down beside her, setting the coffee on the table between them. He didn't push her to drink it, didn't press for conversation. He just sat there, the weight of everything pressed against her ribs. She had spent so long keeping her walls up, keeping herself steady, because she had to. For Jonah, for survival. But now, for the first time in years, she wasn't alone. A sharp breath left her, unsteady, and she pressed the heels of her hands into her eyes. If something happens to him... Wyatt shifted beside her. Then, before she could react, his hand was covering hers. Warm, steady, grounding. Haven should have pulled away. She didn't. He's strong, Wyatt said, his voice quiet. And he has you. Her throat tightened. Why was he doing this? Why was he making it so much harder to keep him at a distance? She turned her head slightly, their faces closer than she had anticipated. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes held something different, something that stripped away the cold, calculating businessman and left behind, something she didn't quite know how to handle. "Why are you here?" she asked, barely above a whisper. His fingers curled slightly over hers. "Because I want to be." The words settled between them, too honest, too raw. Before she could say something, before she could push him away or step closer, the doors at the end of the hall opened. "Haven." She shot to her feet as the doctor approached. "The surgery went well," he said. "Jonah is stable." The relief hit her like a wave. Her legs nearly gave out, and she felt herself lean sideways before she even realized it. Wyatt caught her. His hands settled on her arms, steadying her as she took in her first deep breath in hours. "You're okay," he murmured. "He's okay." She nodded, but the warmth of his hands on her lingered. She stepped back, shaking her head, trying to clear the fog in her chest. Wyatt Calloway wasn't supposed to feel like safety. And yet, as he looked at her, something shifted between them, something neither of them could ignore. "I meant what I said," he told her. "I'm going to make things right." She didn't answer, because she still wasn't sure she could believe him. Haven barely had time to breathe after Jonah's surgery before everything fell apart. She had spent the night at the hospital, sitting by his bedside, watching the slow, steady rise and fall of his chest. For the first time in what felt like forever, she had allowed herself to feel a moment of relief. Then her phone buzzed. At first, she ignored it. But when it didn't stop, a strange unease settled in her chest. Lena's name flashed across the screen. "Lena." "Haven, are you seeing this?" She frowned, opening the link Lena had sent. Her blood turned cold. The headline screamed at her from the screen. "Calloway Empire Scandal. How Wyatt Calloway Profited from the Ruin of the Ellis Family." Her hands shook as she scrolled. The article detailed everything. Simon Ellis's fall from grace, the embezzlement charges, the collapse of her family. And at the center of it all, Wyatt Calloway. The article claimed that Wyatt had not only known about the scandal but had directly benefited from it, that Simon Ellis had been sacrificed to protect the Calloway name. Haven's pulse pounded in her ears. Wyatt had told her he hadn't known, that it had nothing to do with him. Had he been lying the entire time? The weight of every moment between them crashed down on her. The late-night conversations, the way he had comforted her in the hospital, the way he had looked at her when he said he wanted to make things right. Was any of it real? Her stomach twisted as she clicked on the journalist's byline. Derek Caldwell. Of course. Wyatt's rival, the man Wyatt had warned her about. This wasn't a coincidence. This was an attack. But that didn't mean the article wasn't true. Her breath hitched as she stared at the words again. She had let her guard down, let him in, and now it felt like she had been played for a fool. Jonah stirred beside her, and she quickly locked her phone, forcing herself to keep it together. She couldn't fall apart right now, but as she sat there in the sterile hospital room, she knew one thing for certain. She needed answers. And this time, Wyatt wasn't going to talk his way out of it. Haven stormed through the Calloway mansion, her pulse a steady drum in her ears. She had barely slept. The words from the article played on an endless loop in her mind, every syllable another fracture in whatever trust she had started to build. She didn't knock when she reached Wyatt's office. She wasn't here for pleasantries. Wyatt looked up from his desk, his brows drawing together the second he saw her. "Haven, don't." She cut him off, slamming the door behind her. "Don't say my name like that. Like you actually care." Wyatt's jaw tightened. He set his pen down, leaning back in his chair. "You're upset." "Upset?" She let out a short, humorless laugh. "You think that's what this is?" She stepped closer, throwing her phone onto the desk in front of him. The screen still displayed the article, Derek Caldwell's twisted version of the truth. "Tell me," she demanded, voice steady despite the fire in her chest. "Tell me this is a lie." Wyatt's expression didn't flicker. "It's not the truth." "That's not an answer." He exhaled, running a hand through his hair before standing. The distance between them suddenly felt too small, too charged. "I didn't know," he said slowly, like he was choosing each word carefully. "Not then." Haven shook her head, stepping back as anger, betrayal, Disappointment warred inside her. But you know now. A muscle in his jaw twitched. I was trying to fix it. She let out a sharp breath. Fix it? Wyatt, my father. Her voice cracked, and she swallowed hard before continuing. My family lost everything. And you, she forced herself to meet his gaze, to see him for what he really was. You stood on top of the rubble. His expression darkened. You think I wanted this? I think you did nothing to stop it. The words hung between them, heavy and unmoving. Wyatt's voice dropped lower, steadier. If I could change the past, I would. But you can't. Silence. Haven clenched her fists, her breath shallow. She had wanted to believe him. Maybe that was the worst part. Wyatt took a step forward, but this time, she was the one who put distance between them. I was stupid, she whispered, shaking her head. I let myself think. She cut herself off before she could say it. Wyatt's eyes softened, but she didn't want his sympathy. I don't need your help anymore, she said instead. And I don't want anything from you. She turned toward the door, her chest tight. Haven. She stopped, but she didn't turn around. Wyatt didn't move. Don't go. She squeezed her eyes shut for half a second, then forced herself to keep walking. The door shut behind her, and for the first time in his life, Wyatt Calloway felt what it was like to lose something that actually mattered. The apartment was quiet except for the rhythmic sound of Jonah's breathing. He was propped up in bed, a book open on his lap, though Haven knew he hadn't turned a page in the last 10 minutes. He had been watching her instead, studying her with the quiet patience of someone who knew her too well. She had been pacing for the last half hour, lost in her own storm of thoughts. She hated how Wyatt's voice still echoed in her head, how the look in his eyes before she walked away refused to leave her alone. Finally, Jonah sighed. Okay, you need to talk about whatever's making you look like you're losing your mind. Haven shot him a glare, but he just smirked. It was weaker than usual, but it was still him, and for that, she was grateful. I'm fine, she muttered. Jonah rolled his eyes. Lying isn't your strong suit, Have. She sank into the chair beside his bed, rubbing her temples. She didn't even know where to begin. Let me guess, Jonah mused. This is about Calloway? She stiffened, and Jonah huffed a laugh. Yeah, thought so. Haven crossed her arms. He lied. Jonah. Jonah's brows lifted. Did he? She exhaled sharply. The company ruined Dad's life. And he knew. He had files on everything. Jonah was quiet for a moment, then said, You're mad because he knew. But what did he do once he found out? Haven blinked. Jonah sat up a little straighter, his face serious now. Did he try to cover it up? Did he throw money at you and tell you to forget it? Or, he paused. Did he try to fix it? Her throat tightened. That doesn't change the past. No, it doesn't, Jonah agreed. But it changes who he is now. Haven swallowed hard, shaking her head. You don't understand. I understand that the moment I needed surgery, he didn't hesitate. Jonah's voice was steady. I understand that even when you hated him, he still helped. That doesn't sound like a man trying to protect himself. Haven pressed her lips together, because Jonah wasn't wrong. She had been so focused on what Wyatt hadn't done in the past that she hadn't stopped to think about what he had done now. Jonah tilted his head. You don't have to forgive him, Have. But maybe you should ask yourself, what if he's not the villain you made him out to be? She had no answer for that, because for the first time, she wasn't sure. Wyatt Calloway had never been afraid of risk. He had built his empire with calculated decisions, with an unshakable ability to predict every possible outcome before making a move. But this wasn't business. This was a war, and it was personal. Sitting in his office, Wyatt stared at the documents in front of him. Hard proof. The kind that could burn everything Derek Caldwell had built to the ground. Bank transfers. Fabricated reports. The timeline was undeniable. Derek had orchestrated the entire Ellis scandal, using Simon Ellis as a scapegoat to cover up his own financial crimes. Wyatt had spent weeks gathering this evidence. His private investigator had tracked down the missing pieces, offshore accounts, shell companies, falsified records. And now, Wyatt had everything he needed to destroy Derek, but at a cost. The second he leaked this, Derek would retaliate. Wyatt wasn't naive enough to think he wouldn't. His rival had been circling for years, waiting for a moment of weakness. Exposing Derek now meant handing him an opening, and Wyatt knew exactly what he would go after. His company. The very empire Wyatt had spent his life building. He exhaled sharply, gripping the edge of his desk. He had spent years protecting what was his. But for the first time, he realized that some things were worth losing. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. A single press of a button. That was all it took to send the evidence to the media, to authorities, to the world. One decision. And he made it. Wyatt pressed send. The fallout was immediate. By the time the story hit the press, the Calloway name was everywhere. Wyatt Calloway exposes corruption in Ellis case. Derek Caldwell implicated in financial fraud. Wyatt barely had time to breathe before the retaliation hit. Caldwell struck fast, orchestrating a hostile takeover of Calloway Enterprises. Wyatt watched it unfold in real time. The stock prices plummeting, investors jumping ship, board members turning against him. They didn't care about morality. They cared about survival, about money, and Derek was promising them security. Wyatt stood in the conference room, listening to the board vote. One by one, they sided with Derek. One by one, they dismantled everything Wyatt had built. By the end of the night, Calloway Enterprises was no longer his. Wyatt walked out of the office, feeling the weight of loss. Not regret, because even as he stood outside the towering glass building that no longer belonged to him, he knew one thing for certain. The truth was finally out. The news broke in the early hours of the morning. Derek Caldwell had been arrested. Wire fraud, corporate corruption, financial misconduct. The charges stacked high, each one a nail in his coffin. The media had been relentless, reporters swarming the courthouse as he was led inside in handcuffs. Wyatt had one. But as Haven stared at the television screen in her apartment, watching the live coverage, she didn't feel relief. Because Wyatt Calloway was nowhere to be found. She had spent the last 12 hours trying to reach him. Nothing. No texts, no calls, no trace of him anywhere. She hated how worried she was, how much she needed to find him. Jonah had watched her pacing for the past hour, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. You already know where he is. Haven froze. Jonah leaned forward, his voice even. You think a man like Wyatt Calloway just disappears? He went somewhere he knew no one would follow. Her stomach tightened. And then, she knew. The Calloway estate was dark when she arrived. The security team had been dismissed. The cars were gone. The place looked abandoned. But she knew he was inside. Haven pushed open the front door, stepping into the vast, empty space. The mansion had always been cold, but now, it felt different. Like a hollow shell, like something had been stripped from it. She found him in his office. Wyatt sat behind the desk, a half-empty glass of whiskey in front of him. His jacket was draped over the chair, the sleeves of his dress shirt rolled up, exposing the tension in his arms. He didn't look at her when she stepped inside. You shouldn't be here. His voice was low, exhausted. Haven ignored the warning. She wasn't going anywhere. She crossed the room, stopping in front of his desk. Where the hell have you been? He let out a slow breath, finally meeting her gaze. His eyes were different. The sharpness was still there, but now there was something raw underneath. I lost everything, he said simply. Haven's chest ached. Not everything. A faint smirk tugged at his lips, but it didn't reach his eyes. No? Look around, Haven. I built an empire, and in one night, I lost it all. You did the right thing. He huffed a laugh, shaking his head. The right thing doesn't always mean you win. Silence filled the space between them. Haven took a breath. You disappeared. Wyatt ran a hand through his hair, leaning back. Because I didn't want you to see me like this. Something in her cracked. She had spent so long thinking of Wyatt Calloway as indestructible, untouchable. But standing here now, she realized he was just a man. A man who had risked everything, for the truth, for redemption, for her. She took a step closer. You're not alone in this. Wyatt looked up at her then, and for the first time, he let her see everything. No walls, no masks, just him. And it changed everything. The wind carried the scent of salt and sea. the soft hum of waves filling the quiet stretch of coastline. The beach house sat on the edge of the shore, isolated, unassuming, nothing like the towering empire Wyatt had once ruled. Haven stood at the threshold, staring at the weathered wooden door, hesitating for the first time. She had spent weeks looking for him. After that night in his office, after watching him lose everything, he had disappeared again. No calls, no messages, just gone. And she had told herself she wouldn't care, that it didn't matter. But it did. So here she was, standing in front of whatever was left of Wyatt Calloway. She knocked. A few seconds passed before she heard the footsteps. Then, the door opened. Wyatt. His hair was slightly longer, his face more tired, more sun-kissed, but those eyes, those sharp, unreadable eyes, were the same. He stilled when he saw her. Haven. Her chest tightened at the way he said her name, like he hadn't expected to see her again, like it mattered that she was here. She exhaled. Are you going to invite me in? Wyatt studied her for a moment before stepping aside. She walked past him, the scent of ocean air mixed with something warm. His scent, familiar and grounding in a way she hadn't expected. The inside of the house was simple. A bookshelf, a couch, a half-empty glass of whiskey near the window. Nothing like his old life. She turned to face him. You really disappeared this time. Wyatt leaned against the counter, arms crossed. You found me. She didn't miss the way he looked at her. She shook her head. You don't get to do this. His jaw clenched. Do what? Shut me out. Silence stretched between them, charged, unspoken. Then, finally, his walls cracked. I didn't think you'd come, he admitted. Haven took a slow breath, stepping closer. I shouldn't have had to look for you. Wyatt let out a quiet, humorless laugh. Haven, I lost everything. She shook her head. Not everything. His gaze searched hers. Why are you here? Her pulse pounded. Because I love you. She had spent so long fighting it, pushing it away, refusing to let herself feel this. But standing here now, with him, stripped of everything except the man underneath, she couldn't deny it anymore. She swallowed hard, then whispered, Because you matter to me. Wyatt's breath hitched. A single step. That was all it took for him to close the space between them. His hand cupped her face, tentative, like he was giving her time to pull away. But she didn't. She leaned in. And then, he kissed her. It wasn't soft, wasn't hesitant. It was years of tension, of unspoken words, of every moment they had fought against this. This pull between them that had never really let go. The sunset bled into the horizon behind them, but Haven didn't notice. Because for the first time in a long time, she wasn't running anymore. The scent of fresh coffee and sea air filled the small kitchen as sunlight streamed through the window. It had been 3 months since Wyatt had walked away from the empire he had spent his life building. And for the first time in years, he didn't miss it. Haven sat at the worn wooden table, scrolling through her phone, while Jonah sat across from her, carefully slicing a stack of pancakes. His recovery had been slow, but it was steady. The circles beneath his eyes had faded, his energy returning day by day. Wyatt leaned against the counter, watching them with a quiet kind of satisfaction. It was strange, how different his life had become. He no longer wore tailored suits, no longer spent his mornings consumed by stock market reports. And yet, he had never felt more at peace. Are you just going to stare? Or are you going to eat? Jonah smirked, pointing his fork at Wyatt. Haven shot her brother a look. Jonah, what? He grinned, popping a bite of pancake into his mouth. He looks like he's having a deep, emotional moment. Figured I'd ruin it. Wyatt chuckled, shaking his head. Appreciate that. Haven smiled, but it was softer than usual. He saw the way her eyes lingered on him, saw the hesitation behind them. She was still trying to believe this was real. Wyatt understood. After everything they had been through, trust wasn't something easily given. It had to be built, and he would spend the rest of his life proving to her that this, what they had, was real. Later that afternoon, Wyatt pulled into the parking lot of a small, unassuming building in the heart of the city. Haven sat in the passenger seat, her brows slightly furrowed. Are you going to tell me why we're here? He cut the engine and turned to face her. I want to show you something. She narrowed her eyes, but curiosity flickered beneath the skepticism. Wyatt led her inside. The space was simple, bare, but full of possibility. Large windows framed the skyline, and a single desk sat in the middle of the room. Haven turned to him. "This is my new office," he finished. Her lips parted slightly. "You're starting over?" He nodded. "No investors. No board members. Just me." She took a slow breath, looking around the space. "What kind of company?" Wyatt exhaled. "One that actually helps people." She turned to him fully then, something unreadable in her gaze. "You're serious?" "Dead serious." He held her gaze. "I don't want to be the man I was, Haven. That man let power control him. This time, I do it right." Haven didn't speak for a moment. Then, slowly, she stepped closer. "And you think this is enough?" she asked softly. He swallowed. "I don't know. But it's a start." She studied him, and then, finally, her walls lowered. She reached out, threading her fingers through his. "Then let's build something better." Wyatt's grip tightened around hers. This was redemption, and this time, he wouldn't lose it. The golden hue of the late afternoon sun cast a warm glow over Haven's small apartment, filtering through the windows in soft streaks. The familiar scent of home-cooked food lingered in the air, mixing with the faint trace of salt carried from the beach outside. It had been weeks since Wyatt had walked away from his empire. Weeks since everything had changed. And yet, Haven still woke up some mornings expecting to find him gone. She knew it wasn't fair. He had given her no reason to doubt him, not anymore. He had stood by her, stood by Jonah, proved himself in ways she never imagined he would. But trust was a fragile thing, and she was still learning how to hold it. Wyatt, oblivious to her thoughts, sat across from Jonah at the dining table, his sharp gaze locked onto the chessboard between them. "Are you going to make a move?" Wyatt mused. "Or are you trying to win through sheer willpower?" Jonah smirked, tapping his fingers against the side of his face as he studied the board. "It's called strategy, Calloway." "It's called stalling," Wyatt corrected, arms crossed as he leaned back slightly in his chair. Haven stood by the kitchen counter, arms folded, watching them with quiet amusement. It was still strange, watching Wyatt here, in her space, with her family, as if he belonged. More surprising was the way Jonah had let him in. Her brother had never been the trusting type. He had learned, the hard way, that people didn't always keep their promises. But somehow, Wyatt had worked his way into Jonah's guarded heart, one quiet moment at a time. Jonah finally moved a piece, sliding his rook forward. Wyatt didn't hesitate. 2 moves later, checkmate. Jonah groaned, flopping back into his chair dramatically. "I hate you." Wyatt smirked. "You issued the challenge. You could have let me win," Jonah grumbled. Wyatt shrugged. "I don't believe in lying to children." Jonah scowled. "That's a weird way of saying, I'm a sore winner." Haven shook her head, laughing under her breath. Jonah leaned back in his chair, stretching his arms over his head. "You know," he mused, "if you're really trying to redeem yourself, you could buy me a car when I turn 16. Haven shot him a glare. "Not happening." Wyatt raised an eyebrow. "I'll consider it." Jonah grinned, looking far too pleased with himself. Haven, on the other hand, narrowed her eyes. "You are not buying my brother a car." Wyatt leaned in slightly, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "Why? Afraid I'll win him over?" She rolled her eyes but refused to acknowledge the warmth creeping into her chest. Because the truth was, Wyatt had already won him over. Jonah liked him, trusted him, and that terrified her. Because if Wyatt left, if this was temporary, it wouldn't just be her heart breaking. Jonah had lost enough. Haven refused to let him lose again. Later that night, after Jonah had gone to bed, Haven stepped out onto the small balcony. The cool ocean breeze wrapped around her, and she inhaled deeply, trying to steady the emotions tangled inside her. She heard the door slide open behind her, followed by the familiar presence of Wyatt moving to stand beside her. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then, Wyatt exhaled slowly. "You're thinking too hard." She shot him a look. "You don't even know what I'm thinking about." "I don't need to," he said simply. "I know you." Haven swallowed. The words were too easy, too dangerous. Wyatt turned to face her, resting his forearm against the railing. You don't have to wait for me to disappear. She stiffened. He continued. I know that's what you're doing, waiting for this to fall apart, waiting for me to decide it's not worth it. Her chest ached, because he wasn't wrong. Wyatt reached for her hand, his touch gentle, not demanding, not forcing, just offering. She hesitated. Then, slowly, she let her fingers thread through his. I don't know how to do this, she admitted. It was the closest thing to a confession she could give. Wyatt didn't look away. Neither do I. Silence stretched between them, but this time, it wasn't heavy. It was steady, safe. Haven looked out at the ocean, at the dark waves stretching endlessly beneath the moonlight. Wyatt squeezed her hand, grounding her. I'm here, he said softly, and for the first time, she believed him. The morning was crisp, the ocean stretching endlessly beyond the horizon as the waves lapped gently against the shore. The sky was painted in soft hues of pink and gold, the world quiet except for the sound of seabirds overhead. Haven stood on the balcony, wrapped in the oversized sweater she had stolen from Wyatt weeks ago, her hands curled around a steaming cup of coffee. She had never been a morning person, but here, in this life she was still getting used to, she found herself waking up early, watching the sun rise over a world that felt new. A familiar warmth pressed against her back. Wyatt's arms looped around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. You're awake before noon. Should I be concerned? She rolled her eyes, leaning into his embrace despite herself. Shocking, I know. His lips brushed against the side of her temple, a silent kind of affection that had become second nature between them. I like it. Gives me more time to annoy you. She huffed a laugh, shaking her head. As if you needed more time for that. His grip on her tightened for a second before he exhaled, the weight of something unspoken settling between them. What? She asked, turning slightly to look at him. Wyatt studied her for a long moment, something warm and steady in his gaze. She still wasn't used to it, to being looked at like she was something worth staying for. Finally, he pressed a quick kiss to her shoulder and stepped back. Come with me. She blinked. Where? He didn't answer, just took her hand, pulling her inside. The walk along the shore was quiet, the salty breeze tangling through Haven's hair as they made their way down the stretch of sand. The world felt untouched here, far removed from the chaos that had once ruled their lives. She glanced at Wyatt as they walked, bare feet sinking into the cool morning sand. He was different now, not weaker, not lost, just lighter. For so long, he had carried an empire on his shoulders, convinced it was the only thing that defined him. But here, without boardrooms and stock prices, he was just a man. And she loved him for that. Wyatt slowed his steps near a cluster of smooth rocks. The sun had risen fully now, its golden light casting long shadows across the sand. He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. Haven raised an eyebrow. Are we just admiring the view, or? Wyatt reached into his pocket, and then he knelt down. Haven's breath caught. Her heart slammed against her ribs as he pulled out a small, velvet box, flicking it open to reveal a simple, elegant ring. Nothing extravagant, just perfect. Wyatt smirked up at her. Before you say anything, yes, I know this isn't exactly traditional. No fancy dinner, no grand gestures, no orchestra playing in the background. Haven's throat tightened. Wyatt. But that's not us, he continued, his voice softer now. We're not grand gestures. We're bad first impressions and stolen jackets. We're arguments in kitchens and silent conversations on balconies. Her vision blurred slightly. Wyatt exhaled, rolling his shoulders. I lost my fortune, but I found you. And that's the best trade I've ever made. A tear slipped down her cheek before she could stop it. Say yes, he murmured, his confidence dimmed only by the barest trace of vulnerability. She sank to her knees in front of him, pressing her forehead to his. Yes, she whispered. Wyatt let out a breath that sounded suspiciously like relief, before he slipped the ring onto her finger. Haven laughed, wrapping her arms around his neck, holding on like she never planned to let go. And for the first time in their lives, They weren't fighting anymore. They had already won. The sky stretched endlessly above them, painted in hues of orange and soft pink as the sun dipped toward the horizon. The beach house had become something more than just a temporary escape. It had become home. Haven stood on the back deck, a warm breeze teasing the hem of her dress as she looked out at the waves. The past year had changed everything, reshaping the life she once knew into something unrecognizable, but better. She heard the sound of laughter behind her. Turning, she spotted Jonah and Wyatt in the yard, caught in the middle of what had started as a simple conversation and quickly turned into some kind of ridiculous competition. "I'm just saying," Jonah argued, arms crossed. "You can't call yourself an athlete if all you do is lift weights and sit in meetings." Wyatt smirked, rolling up the sleeves of his shirt. "Are you calling me out, kid?" Jonah grinned. "I'm just saying if we raced right now, I'd win." Wyatt let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "You're recovering from surgery, and you think you can outrun me?" Jonah raised a brow. "Are you scared?" Haven covered her mouth to stifle a laugh as Wyatt muttered something under his breath before kicking off his shoes and taking off down the beach. Jonah followed, barefoot, sand flying behind him as the two of them raced toward the water. Haven leaned against the railing, shaking her head. A year ago, she never would have imagined this scene. Wyatt Calloway, once a cold and calculated businessman, chasing after her younger brother like they had been family their entire lives. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Lena, holding a glass of wine in one hand, watching the scene unfold with a smirk. "If you had told me a year ago that Wyatt Calloway would be here, playing on a beach, barefoot, I would have thought you were lying." Haven laughed, taking the glass Lena offered. "If you had told me a year ago, I would have agreed." Lena nudged her. "And yet, here we are. You, engaged to the once feared Wyatt Calloway, and me? I finally have proof that miracles exist." Haven rolled her eyes, but she couldn't argue. It did feel like a miracle. Later that evening, after the laughter had faded and the sun had fully set, Wyatt found Haven sitting on the deck, legs tucked beneath her as she sipped from a mug of tea. He slid down next to her, their shoulders brushing. The touch felt like second nature now. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then, Wyatt exhaled. "I don't think I ever said thank you." Haven glanced at him, brow furrowing. "For what?" He tilted his head slightly, watching her in that way that always made her feel like he saw too much. "For believing in me," he said quietly. Her heart squeezed. Wyatt had changed so much, not just because of her, but because he had chosen to. He had let himself unlearn the things that once defined him, let go of the ruthless ambition that had once consumed his life. She reached over, slipping her fingers through his. "I didn't do that," she whispered. "You did." He exhaled slowly, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. She had never imagined a life like this, a life where love wasn't something to fear, but something to trust. Haven let her head rest against his shoulder, closing her eyes. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't waiting for something to go wrong. She was just here, and it was enough. 1 year later, the small office in the city was nothing like the corporate empire Wyatt had once ruled, but it was his. He stood by the window, watching as the city moved below him, alive and untamed. A knock on the door made him turn. Haven leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "Are you ready?" He glanced around the office, at the plans pinned to the wall, at the small but growing company that was built on integrity, not greed. He smiled. "Yeah, I'm ready." Haven walked over, lacing her fingers through his. "Come on." "Jonah's waiting." Wyatt let himself be pulled toward the door, leaving behind the past and stepping fully into the future. As they stepped into the evening air, he didn't look back, because for the first time, he had everything he needed. They drove down the coastal road in easy silence, the radio humming softly in the background. The sky stretched wide above them, full of endless possibility. Jonah was waiting at the restaurant when they arrived, grinning when he spotted them. "Took you long enough." Haven rolled her eyes, hugging him. "We were on time." Jonah snorted. "You're never on time." Wyatt chuckled, resting his hand on Haven's back. The conversation flowed easily, full of warmth, full of love. When the night ended, and they walked out onto the quiet street. Haven glanced up at Wyatt. "You're happy," she observed. He met her gaze, and for once, there was no hesitation. "I am," he said simply. She smiled, tilting her head up to kiss him. When they pulled apart, Wyatt exhaled, a smirk tugging at his lips. "You know," he murmured, "some things are worth more than money." Haven raised a brow. "Oh." He brushed his fingers over her cheek, his voice steady. "Love is one of them." And as they stood there, bathed in the golden glow of the city, wrapped in the quiet certainty of each other, Wyatt Calloway, once a man who had everything but felt nothing, finally understood what it meant to have everything that mattered.